I'm Joanna Settle. I'm an arts professor of theater here at NYU Abu Dhabi. And it is with great joy that I will serve as moderator and offer you our final panel today. I'm so grateful to Al-Mawrid, thank you Salwa, thank you Nada, for this tremendous symposium, which I've learned so much about. In the theater program here, we require our students in their first class and their last class to present archives of their work. And in fact, they're graded on the archive of their projects. That's how their projects are evaluated. And we consider the archive not just as a record, but as a site of potential motivation for revision and as a site for the generation of new works down the road. So this has been extremely provocative for my pedagogy, as was talking to each of our three marvelous panelists, who I'll introduce very briefly. You have their bios in your packet. Ala Younis, who you'll hear from first, is an artist and also a research scholar with Al-Mawrid. We'll then hear from Meitha Dabbagh, who'll be joining us remotely because Dubai is not available to us right now. Hi, May. May is an associate professor of social research and public policy here at NYU, and she's a co-PI of Al-Mawrid, focusing her work on the Haraka lab. And then lastly, we'll hear from Meitha Almazrouei, who is a Ph.D. candidate at MIT, studying history, theory, and criticism of architecture. So thank you all for joining us here at NYU. And for our very last panel, I'll pass it now to Ala.
Hello, everyone. Okay. So there are 3 layers, at least, in this presentation. So please try as much as you can to read the stuff that are on these slides, especially the italics on the right. 4 decades have passed since Shakir Hassan al-Said published his volumes, Chapters from the History of Fine Art Movement in Iraq, which he worked on after resigning from his position at the Archive Department of the Directorate of Fine Arts in Baghdad. The Iran-Iraq War was raging, and Shakir had begun burning parts of the surfaces of his paintings, symbolizing the effects of the Iranian bombings on the Iraqi cities. The Minister of Culture was not pleased with Shakir's exhibition at Riwaq Gallery in Baghdad and exclaimed to some artists, I don't want someone to burn paintings and tell me this is about war. It was Shakir's esteemed status that relieved an enforced retirement on him from teaching at the Institute of Fine Arts to become a transfer to the archive, from which he requested a time off between 1981 and 82 to research his book. The war ended in 1988, and the Gulf War loomed from 1990. At that time, Shakir and other artists had started to shuttle between Baghdad and Amman, activating the Jordanian art scene by depositing their homegrown expertise at the service of local institutions. On February 12, 1992, Shakir stood among his latest works in a solo exhibition at Abdel Hamid Shuman Foundation in Amman. He was giving a lecture and showing his artworks using a projector and 35mm slides he brought with him from Baghdad. Shakir voiced a discontent with the quality of the images. They were not conveying the details of his works and the visual references he inherited from Baghdad's history, geography, and religious and war wall inscriptions. The artist spoke about his use of numbers, letters, cracks, and burnt surfaces. He also mentioned the public and private collections for each painting. Seeking confirmation on some of his concepts, he looked towards one of the attendees and asked, "Isn't this right, Ismail?" At that moment, well, I thought, my memory, that was the faces, but not in the film, the faces of the other attendees, as well as the camera, panned towards the seated fellow Iraqi artist Ismail Fattah Turk, a prominent figure in the Baghdad Modern Art Group, whose presence further underscored the significance of this lecture. Between 1990 and 1992, Shakir served as an art consultant to the foundation, during which he curated a series of similar meetings bringing together Iraqi, Palestinian, and Jordanian artists and critics to debate their views on art. The programs contributed continued to be the hallmark of the Foundation's Darat al-Funun, inaugurated in '93 as a home for the Arab arts. Such meetings were attended by artists, intellectuals, academics, collectors, besides young and general audience. The public or programs can run parallel to geographically themed art exhibitions. Besides being able to see works by modern Arab artists, it was also possible for people in Amman to hear artists speak, but also to ask them questions. Darat al-Funun circulated its program announcements on posters and printed guides, exhibition guides, and video recorded the openings and the events. Berlin-based Syrian artist Marwan Qassab-Bashi had more than one of these meetings with the Dara audience. Perhaps the most famous was the meeting with the writer Abdurrahman Munif on November 20th, 1996. In this meeting, they both presented their book, A Journey of Life and Art. Munif, who lived in Amman, then in Baghdad, before moving to Damascus, informed on the beginnings of his art encounters. He said, out of curiosity, I established links with some art in Baghdad by means of attending exhibitions. But I have not attempted to meet the artists. I used to watch them from afar. Their world was as dangerous as it was tempting. There was a distance between us. I would linger while walking alongside Jawad Salim's house to glimpse through the windows onto the paintings hanging on the walls and contemplate the finished and unfinished sculptures. At night, I would stop, observe, and study them. Paintings looked so beautiful, especially when the lights highlighted their outstanding features. Munif's confession revealed the barriers he perceived existing, not between him and the art, but with the creators of the work and/or their host institutions. The solitary relationship gave him the freedom to interpret. It could only be shaken if someone claimed to know better than the interpreter. This person can be the artist himself or the host institution or members in the audience. The moderator thanked Munif for the introduction, which he considered a segue from Munif's world into Marwan's, and asked the audience if they had questions. He limited the time of any question to be 2 minutes. A man from the audience stood up and in an Iraqi accent, he thanked the institution and the lecturers, praised the works briefly, then expressed his opinion. Marwan has not made achievements at the level of content because painting is no longer just about techniques. I checked the exhibited works and have another opinion. Marwan focuses on one theme, the crushed, the oppressed human, as we see in these distressed faces. Despite the diversity of the subjects he captured from reality, the great artist did not diversify his theme. The man was taking some time trying to maneuver this acknowledgement of Marwan's artistic abilities while critiquing them, of course, but two members of the audience sitting in the front row signaled to the moderator, indicating that the question has exceeded the 2-minute limit. Exercising their power over the speaking audience, the sitting audience managed to interrupt the critic who has to hastily conclude on somewhat negative comment about the works or the structure of the paintings. And meanwhile, you could hear another voice in the audience objecting, "Are these rules of such and such?" Marwan bounced back the question to his questioner, interrogated the differentiation between concept and content, and concluded the talk. As the camera panned towards the sitting, Marwan's painting, The Standing, أو الواقف, appeared in the background. Another meeting was organized with Marwan on April 18th, 1998 at Darat al-Funun. The audience this time asked Marwan about his relationship with Berlin, his education and settling there. Then a woman with a Lebanese accent addressed Marwan. "You studied Arabic language at Damascus University. What made you study painting afterwards?" she asked. He replied, "You know, in our country there is a compulsory military training." She hurriedly exclaimed, "Ah, you escaped from the military." He replied firmly, I am a better soldier. I am a better soldier, meaning that his artistic work equals, if not surpasses, the military's work. Then he smiled. She continued, well, this is the first time I hear of you. They told me Abdurrahman Munif wrote a book about you, and Adonis wrote some poetry. You had to be a phenomenon for those to write about you. What's your connection with the Arab writers? Marwan replied with a single sentence, they love me. How much should an artist speak, and with whom? Does he need to speak at all in the presence of his artworks? And what about in the presence of his papers? I was studying architecture at the University of Jordan when a giant poster of Marwan's Al-Waqif, the standing, appeared in the department's corridor. A slender, fair-skinned man leans towards the left side of the painting. A white cover on his head hides part of his eyes and his face, clasps the ends of his fingers as if rubbing them, just like this. It was around 1996, I believe, and the poster appeared early to prepare us for the artist solo exhibition at Darat al-Funun. Students, including myself, must have carried copies of this poster to their studios. However, I fail to remember if I had visited any of Marwan's exhibitions, and I do regret that, but also losing the poster. However, I was keen to attend the lectures organized by the Architects Division at the Dara, especially a lecture organized in '97 for the architect, or with the architect Zaha Hadid. At the time, I was studying Zaha's drawings, which expanded the whole department's imagination about rebellious architecture. Many of us imitated Zaha's drawings. I remember nothing from the lecture, in fact, except a question that came from the audience to the architect. Do you use a scale? Well, I understood that it's the architectural ruler with the 3 sides and 6 measures, but Zaha was furious. She went on listing aspects of strength in her practice and technical training. It was an embarrassment to the person who was asking. Well, I returned to this incident in 2018 when I spoke with Shumon Basar, an architect who worked with Zaha, and I asked him, how did Zaha make her drawings? He said, we all worked on them by hand for days, often missing deadlines for competitions. I asked again, but what did she draw with? He replied, she had her preferences from French curves. These French curves are plastic pieces that help manually draw neat curves in architectural drawings. I understand Zaha and Marwan's answers, but also note the privilege they used to control the amount of information disclosed to the general audience when they did not like the questions or the interpretation put forward by the audience. The one standing here is the person who decided to ask a question stared at by everyone before the speaker chose a method for answering. Perhaps it could have been more practical and less severe of Zaha's response if she just answered French curves instead of scale. Perhaps her answers came violent because she thought scale here was a proportion, a doubt from the questioner, not simply a question of tool. Perhaps she was angry because she thought it was the opposite. Shakir Hassan al-Said used to burn his work in the bathroom sink, and once in Amman, the fire ignited and burned part of the house he was staying in. I linked these burnings and the bathtub to a performance by Egyptian artist Amal Qinnawi at Darat al-Funun in 2007. We stayed up in my office at the Dara, pinning the dress and rehearsing the performance. Next evening, I slowly uncovered the projector's lens for the room film to come on screen in front of the audience, while Amal was sitting on stage sewing the dress. The film was about the collapse of a woman's world controlled by attachments, traditions, and illnesses. As soon as the film ended, Amal set the dress on fire. It perished in 1 minute. Amal and Shakir Hassan used fire as a metaphor for internal fragility caused by social or political oppressors. For me, fire as art medium, silence as answer, audience as container of knowledge, are things I learned about reading these archives from being somewhere inside them, as a user, or as someone who was there in the past, mostly sitting. Thank you.
Thank you, Ala. Do we have May online? Okay, May Dabbagh.
Hi, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to be here with you, discussing the Generative Archive and learning from you. Although my home is in Dubai, which is not very far, and it's dry, thankfully, after the storm, but the surrounding area is like a complete lake, so you sort of can't get in or out. But I'm really glad that I can be here on Zoom, and as you'll see, I'm also actually really grateful to this unplanned lake and the standstill moment, because paradoxically, that's actually at the heart of how I'm thinking about what is generative. So at NYU Abu Dhabi, I have been for 5 years running a lab called Haraka, which is part of Mawrid, and it bridges the social sciences and the arts. And Haraka is a multivalent word in Arabic. So on the one hand, it means movement, like political movement or physical movement, but also it refers to the diacritics. So the little shapes on top of letters in the Arabic language that give the language meaning. So for many years, and I'm going to switch here to my PowerPoint presentation, to share something with you. Let's see if this works. Okay. Can somebody just give me a signal or say something to let me know if you're able to see my screen? Yes. Okay, great. All right. So for many years at NYU Abu Dhabi, my life looked like this. And as you can see from that short video, which has many of the harakat that I just mentioned, fatha, dhamma, shadda, but what I had omitted actually was a really important one called sukoon. But a year and a half ago, the sukoon came to find me and remind me that I had forgotten her. As soon as I was given a sabbatical and things started slowing down for me, I was hit by an extreme chronic pain, a sciatica, which is a kind of pain that runs from the lower part of your spine all the way down your leg to your heel. So you're unable to sit, to walk, or even to lie down. And during that time, my world became very small. So small, in fact, that it would fit inside this diacritic, the sukoon. And after many months of trying all sorts of things, 6 months actually, I ended up asking for a medical leave because I was spending more time face down on examination tables in the offices of doctors, chiros, physios, and osteos. And I was not able to think or feel. And really, it was during that period that I was able to slowly move away from a place of rejecting my reality to resenting it, fighting it, working really hard to just fix it, and then finally to accepting it. And it was really in that last stage that my life started expanding in generative ways. And I was able to see the sukoon not as a non-movement or a non-sound, but as a necessary way of moving. And so I had been clutching to this idea of repair when in fact what I needed to do was to be open to the idea of healing. And so during this time, I started experimenting with alternative methodologies, things like somatic experiencing, embodiment, and awareness practices that go beyond the Cartesian mind-body divide. And so you'll see here, for example, on the right side of my screen is something called the slow walk. It actually has different names and different practices, but most people are aware of walking. In fact, you probably do it all the time and you pay very little attention to it, except knowing the difference between kind of walking slowly and then walking fast. But if you start to walk slowly and break it down so much, literally second by second, frame by frame, what happens is that this very familiar activity becomes completely defamiliarized, and you start to experience your own body in a completely different way. And so many of these insights made their way into a new class that I would teach at NYU Abu Dhabi called the Body Archive. And so my students and I explore questions like this. What does it mean for the body to be a source of knowledge? How do our bodies connect us to the accrual of past history and the shifting landscapes of future trajectories? Is knowing thyself through the body a necessary condition for decolonization? What sense of attunement emerges from remembering the body as more than itself? And so in this inquiry, we read all sorts of texts. I'll give you kind of one quick example. In reading on decoloniality and decolonization, I picked 4 authors from different geographies and different disciplines: Achille Membe, Gurminder Pamba, Munir Fasha, and Walter Mignolo. They're often understood as kind of historians, sociologists, education specialists, and a cultural anthropologist who also does literature, but truly, actually, they are public intellectuals. And all of them are critical of their own disciplines and the ways in which they're implicated in notions of colonial modernity. And so in elevating these kinds of voices that speak beyond the global north or reproduce ideas of disciplines in very particular kinds of ways, I'm hoping to get my students and myself to really think about the kinds of things that we learn, but also unlearn. And in reading these texts, we don't just simply learn from experts or public intellectuals about their insights, but we also develop a practice of embodied reading. For example, what does it mean when our eyes gloss over a page and the back of our neck starts tensing up? What is it that you've read when a little ball starts hardening in your stomach? Hardening, and growing larger. What happens when the notes that we're taking on the side of the page suddenly become faster than our ability to write them down, and we press down really hard with the pencil? What does it mean when we read in an embodied way? But going beyond the individual body, or the idea of the body as simply singular or separate from its environment, I tried to incorporate some somatic practices that also help us really think about the connection between our body and other human bodies, other non-human bodies, and the non-living. And so, for example, this is an exercise that we did, in fact, with an artist, Ana Bidart, who's Uruguayan Mexican. And it's a very simple exercise, actually, where you have a string that's laid out across the room, and you're supposed to be able to take turns moving the string, but you can't speak to the people around you. And so what unfolds in what seems like a very simple exercise is a deep awareness about how we're holding our bodies, what we're doing with them, interacts and affects the people that are around us. Finally, I also introduced some kind of formal practices that artists use for thinking of the body as an archive. And here I'm really going to present them for illustrative purposes, so kind of not really get into the details of the artists themselves or even the work. But the first here is Sara Brahim, who's a Saudi artist She's trained in dance, performance, and a variety of kind of embodied practices. And you'll see here in two stills that I have in the middle of the slide from a work called Adagio, a kind of image of the sea where Sarah's figure is on the left at the very beginning of this video. And then if you move to that image at the bottom, you'll see she sort of slowly walks across the screen until she reaches the end. But what you see on the right is actually an image that's taken from the camera that she's holding here, very close to her body, so closely, in fact, that she talks about it as an external organ. And so this camera gives us a very different view and feeling of what is happening in the same landscape, because this camera captures the sea from a vantage point of Sarah's body as she's breathing, as her feet are walking on the sand, and as it interconnects with the birds, the boats, and the other elements of nature in the environment. A totally different approach to thinking about body and archives comes from two artists that I hosted recently. Reem Falaknaz, who lives between Dubai and Muscat, and Lara Shaheen, who lives between New York and Beirut. And they had a joint exhibition of which you can see the publication, Swallow This, on the left-hand side, where they sort of explore the body and gender politics, specifically in this region. And I'll just give you, I guess, a bit of a kind of a tidbit here. So Reem has a project that was called If a Hymen Breaks and No One Hears It, where she archives the various sites of exchanges by experts. So these can be sheikhs, doctors, beauty clinics, with young women concerning hymen reconstructive surgery. And so you'll see here in the middle of the screen at the top, a screenshot of WhatsApp exchanges between one of these experts and a potential client, a potential customer, with claims of sort of expertise and things working. And she sort of almost ethnographically documents the ways in which certain kinds of language are used. For example, calling the potential client my dear in this kind of infantilizing way, and also documents the political economy of exchange. So how much these kinds of procedures cost, how people finance those kinds of procedures, and how they get to talk about their experiences. Lara, on the other hand, in her work, Bless Your Beauty, or in Arabic, Khalili Jamalik, shows us actually this public billboard, which shows in Lebanon, which you can see here in the middle of the screen. And she documents how actually it's not a singular billboard, but in fact, it keeps repeating itself every few miles until it becomes a full landscape of advertisement for plastic surgery. And similar to Reem, her research is not simply kind of in documentary format where she's capturing images, but she actually kind of engages a sort of an almost like anthropological or ethnographic stance where she goes to some of these clinics and examines the kind of like details of the exchange that happened between the doctors, the cosmetic surgery experts, and the potential clients. And so in both of these cases, what they highlight to us is that in many ways, the body is implicated in kind of these very private and taboo types of exchanges, yet at the same time is hyper visible and public in the most obvious of ways. The third one, and I think this is maybe the last one I'm going to share, is an exhibition that was called Crystal Clear, that was held recently, so February of this year, curated by Sarah Ben Safwan and Zainab Hassoun, who are both curators based in Dubai. And they have a collective called Studio Salasil, which is how they work. And in this exhibition, I asked them to kind of share with us what it meant for them to do this kind of work, to curate an exhibition as we are all witnessing live an ongoing genocide, especially that many of the artists that are involved in their show, and even for them as curators, the ongoing political events have taken a really big toll on their lives, on our ideas of community, on our ideas of what kind of world we live in actually is at the moment. And so in their conversations with us, they shared some of this, not only the curatorial work, but the sort of effects on their bodies and how they had to change some of the kind of basic ways in which they did their work. But they also talked about the choices of artists that they engaged with and how, in some ways, actually thinking about archiving this moment meant that they could use and invent new rules for kind of shaping what they were doing. And so one example of the work in their exhibition is Ahmed Makiya, who in fact is a publisher, writer, and editor. But he has this kind of super interesting publication, Sumad, which actually is a sort of guide to self-publishing in Abu Ghraib prison. And you can see here on the right, I'm just going to play it so you can see, there's like a tutorial, which is available publicly on YouTube, that allows you to see how when you receive this publication, you can actually yourself recreate the ways that prisoners in Abu Ghraib hid their writings inside a laundry detergent box called Sumad. And here I'm reminded of Antonio Gramsci's idea of the body archive, in which he says the starting point of critical elaboration is the consciousness of what one really is, and is knowing thyself as a product of the historical processes to date, which has deposited in you an infinity of traces without leaving an inventory. And so I'm not going to go through the rest because I think that kind of gives you a bit of an idea, but what I'd like to sort of maybe conclude with is really thinking about what it means for our conversation on the Generative Archive if we're taking the body into consideration. So if the body is the archive, who is the archivist? Who has access to archival materials? And is preservation actually the primary purpose? How would we center feeling in archival processes? And finally, this is perhaps the thought that came to me, or the question that came to me as I was reflecting on this particular moment in my life, unable to come to Abu Dhabi because of this lake that surrounds my house. Is acceptance a condition for being generative? What does it mean for us to not simply reject, fix, and push, but be open to acceptance as a potential mode for being generative? Thank you.
Meitha?
Hi, everyone. It's nice to present among friends and scholars I admire today and sit around the table with May, Ella, and Joanna. Throughout the presentations in the past 2 days, we saw how documents can be sites and subjects of interpretation across disciplines, where they serve as historical clues. I'd like to start with a 7th century anecdote. One morning, after performing a communal prayer in the early days of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad was walking with his family and a close companion, Jabir ibn Samra, At a certain point, the Prophet turned to his friend and patted his cheek with a hand so laden with fragrance that Jabir sensed it was as though Muhammad had just pulled his hand out of a scent bag of a perfumer. Stories such as these of the Prophet's love and extensive use of fragrance and their pre-Islamic cultural underpinnings form an essential foundation for understanding how scent materialized and came to inform their applications centuries later. The Prophet set the tone for preferring certain fragrant materials, specifically musk and amber, and his followers adopted and adapted these preferences. In the following centuries, under Umayyad and Abbasid rule, medicine men forged a more direct link between the preferred perfumes of the Islamic period and their medical application. In my work, I draw from these textual sources, such as Hadith and the Quran and other Arabic language manuscripts, focus on adornments of the body and travel logs that shed light on how fragrances occupied domestic and public spaces in the medieval Arabian Peninsula. I enter the archive and read the documents through an architectural lens, where my overarching question is, can we speak about architecture without describing its volume? And if volume and atmosphere are intrinsic to architecture discourse and the organization of space, what constitutes volume in architecture? The relationship I'm trying to draw is that we often think of material massing when writing about architecture, but how does that amorphous enter the discourse? Here, scent plays a crucial role in revealing the lived experience of space and the seemingly invisible elements that shape our perception of the built environment. I refer to this constellation of efforts to release scent in space as the materiality of scent. I address this by asking how scent was mediated historically, identifying how fragrant materials were recorded and how they can be recalled from the archives. Where I mine for hidden smells, illustrated smells, and descriptions of the olfactory in already well-researched manuscripts, specifically from 13th century Baghdad, where the city and expansive territory was under the Abbasid rule from 860 and for almost 400 years. My initial interest in the Abbasid Empire stemmed from the remarkable translation movement. This movement involved translating books from various languages, such as Greek, Pahlavi, and Sanskrit, into Arabic. It was instrumental in introducing new forms of knowledge and text into the Islamic world. Genres like recipe books and travel logs that circulated contained textual descriptions of the period and a window into understanding how daily life was lived within the spaces of the Abbasid Empire. This was extremely important to me as a body of evidence because almost no material or architectural evidence remains from the Abbasid period. I resort to scent as an alternative method in piecing together a material history of an empire that leaves little or no architectural footprint. Scent offers an additional sensory vantage point to read material configurations beyond the lens of formal analysis as witnessed by the eyes. Manuscripts from this period describe in encyclopedic detail the types of plant perfumes that were used widely for decoration. For example, in Dinawiri's Kitab al-Nabat, or the Book of Plants, lists the most important materials used in adorning spaces, where they were used on all their occasions and adorned themselves with them in their weddings, sorrows, and religious rituals. There are descriptions of fragrancing the bride's chambers, for instance, where ingredients were applied simultaneously on the body and on furniture. Words like drenched, layered, and soaked appear in textual descriptions of how people, including the Prophet himself, on whose head musk would, quote, glisten, applied these fragrant materials to their bodies. This method of coating the skin of the body was later mirrored in how fragrant materials were layered onto the surfaces of sacred spaces, starting from the Umayyads as well, where a saffron paste called khaluq would be used to coat the Kaaba, as recorded in Kitab Akhbar Mecca. And then later the Abbasids used a compound perfume called Ghalia, which was a mixture of musk and amber, the Prophet's favorite scents, also on the Kaaba, to quote the Kaaba, and the Dome of the Rock as well. Adam Bursi writes about this a lot in his work. The texts show that the application of aromatic materials was never passive. Rather, the evidence suggests that there was an active and intentional and thoughtful consideration of how fragrance was applied, not only on the human body, but in domestic spaces and public spaces, where there was a sense of wanting to soak the skin and places of worship with a particular scent. In today's presentation, I invite you to contemplate the significance of fleeting substances and materials in our understanding of space, and how such materials can be recorded or retrieved from the archives. Allow me to illustrate this with a vivid example from a 13th century Abbasid court. Deep in the women's quarters of the 13th century Abbasid interior, a stout, bejeweled woman squats as she prepares to give birth, possibly to the next heir of the caliphate. Depicted in the painted illustration found in a larger manuscript of poetry about the political scene of the day, the woman leans on two midwives, supporting her on either side, while a few steps away to the left stands a feminine figure holding a large incense burner, releasing fragrance, maybe frankincense, perhaps to help calm the woman's nerves, or perhaps to purify the air for the unpleasant smells of childbirth. The entire illustration exudes an air of wealth and a sense of the power hierarchy of the time, including a segregation of the genders, with the masculine situated above the feminine, and showing the various roles played by those who served the masters. The portrayal of fragrance in this image is subtle, depicted in the bottom corner, as though it was designed to be missed or passed over by the viewer. It's peripheral and would easy to be disregard the part played by scent as unimportant within a scene whose focal point is the ruler, sitting above on an ornate cushion woven from the golden threads, and his wife perhaps in a separate room beneath him. And yet, for scent to be depicted in the document in this way shows that it carries some important value, either social or ceremonial, or perhaps even practical, given that at the time, childbirth with all its pungent smells did not happen in the hospital, but instead within the domestic milieu. In this way, fragrance could have served the purpose of maintaining a pleasant aroma and helped keep a pristine environment, no matter what might be happening within the walls of the court. By analyzing this illustration, we could see that the portrayal of fragrance is intentionally peripheral and seemingly overlooked. Similarly, when studying the history of architecture, our focus tends to revolve around visual perception, sight primarily. However, in professions like architecture, where sight dominates the analysis of space, we often overlook the roles played by our other senses. This blind spot hinders our understanding of how considerations such as fragrance influence the design and utilization of space. However, to understand how the fragrant materials arrived at the court, it's necessary to understand the sequence of the supply chain in procuring them and the invisible, perhaps feminine labor behind the production of the fragrances. Where and how were these raw materials pounded, cooked, and turned into fragrant perfume compounds that were later burnt or sprayed within the courts? The textual archive does not contain direct evidence of the process needed to transfer the raw ingredients into the material substances mentioned in the text. In fact, some herbal recipes depict the extensive preparation involved, including pounding raw materials for a long duration of time or stirring for multiple hours. This points towards that, contrary to prevalent discourse, specifically around phenomenology in architecture, sense deployment in space was not coincidental and plays an integral role in the assemblage of architecture space. And then scent can be thought of as invisible material only when it's released. The documents demonstrate how scent was considered and applied within society, where perfumers, medical experts, and scientists of that era wrote about fragrance in various genres, including poisonous recipes to court diaries and poetry. It's essential to acknowledge that fragrance ingredients were used for healing the body and psyche. During that time, there was no clear separation between doctors and perfumers, as both professions contributed to the knowledge of using aroma to promote well-being. One document, Kitab al-Sumum, that you see here, this is the introduction, by Ibn al-Wahshiyya, is practically notable in how deliberately it makes sense a formal category where smell is a section on its own, or a chapter on its own. It's the only medicinal manuscript of the Abbasid period explicitly describing scent as a method of transferring poison. For every recipe of poison offered by Ibn al-Wahshiyya, there's also an antidote that an individual can use to heal themselves if they recognize the symptoms described. This document was inspired by Indian remedies brought into the Abbasid world by caliphs who commissioned writers to travel to other regions to acquire knowledge. It outlines how fragrances can be created for the sinister purpose of causing death, and how ingredients can be mixed and inhaled as an antidote as well. One of the limits of studying the Abbasid period through the vantage point of scent is that there aren't any descriptions in recipe books that mention spatially the environment where the fragrant materials were prepared or used within the courts, while manuscripts like the book on poison, translated into English here, describe specific objects and scenes within the court. It doesn't specify where those objects and scenes were situated in space, such as the name of the room or the dimensions even. As an example of a scene described, quote, "Thus it is that the kings of the East all have the peacock present at their tables. As soon as it smells a poisonous food or beverage, it flaps its wings, spreads its tail, drags and strikes it, stands on its breast, drags, goes, comes, and is excited. Ancient kings and nobles concealed the reason for using the peacock so that ignorant people would believe they were kept for their beauty," end quote. The scene described leaves a vivid image in the reader's mind. The king seated at the table, possibly with other noblemen, waiting for a cue from the peacock, presumably standing not far from the table, and that the food is safe to eat. And yet, even while the spatial elements are not described in detail, certain characteristics about the space could be extracted. It must be a large and open onto a garden, if not situated outside entirely. Having a peacock spread its tail, which spans about 6 feet long, and excitedly walking around and striking it, points towards an idea of the scale of the dining space and the durability of the materials. And yet, mentioned within this scene shows that the knowledge of the senses was at the forefront of consciousness. Knowing that poisons can be inhaled invisibly, kings found ways to detect imperceptible ones, in this case by using one of nature's glorious birds. I'd like to end by saying the textual archive helped identify the different ways scent informed early Islamic architecture. It also identifies a shift towards specific ingredients that were solidified during the Prophet's time and carried through to be part of the Abbasid material library. And text helped identify how materials that do not have volume in architecture, materials that are seemingly peripheral or an afterthought, can be used to interrogate and understand the use of space. Thank you very much. And thank you, Salwa and Neda and Maha, for the invitation. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much for these really generous presentations. I'm really grateful. As I was listening to the three investigations, this panel seems to have really lifted forward just how personal, not only the archives themselves, of course, which are often a collection of things not intended to be an archive, but remnants of a life and a practice lived. And then, of course, each of you have brought these really intimate questions and very personal presences to how you what you bring to the archive as a question and how you intersect with it. Thinking about the poster that you had that you've lost to the event you didn't attend, and May using a personal injury as a way to more deeply interrogate an archive. And of course, trying to chase the scent, the much described and long gone scent through architecture. It's really, it's very generous of all of you to share something as short as 10 minutes on subjects that are so personal. So it's with great appreciation. Yeah. I wonder if we want to open, if anyone has any burning questions, or if the panelists have questions for each other. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your paper. I was thinking a lot about, two things. First of all, that we all live with sense, right? They are there from past times, and they continue to be, and there are particular orders to, like sense to certain body actions or stories. There's also stories in the bodies that have sense, etc. So basically, how different do you imagine that these worlds have been from, like, between what was and what is now? And maybe the other question is basically, how did you think about tracing it all the way back to that era?
Why that era came from the documents themselves, where the manuscripts and the books are often labeled as history of. I guess academics that work in the history of science focus on these books from a very material perspective. And when I had access to these manuscripts and the textual sort of worlds they opened up, I realized that there were a lot of fragrant ingredients mentioned in these seemingly medicinal recipes. And that's how, that was the linker, that was the entry point. It was the archive, it was the textual sort of body of work. And how is it different now? I think there's, I was trying to trace back a lot of these materials in like poetry and during the Jahiliyyah and how that shifts. And for me, within the historical sort of realm, it was very obvious that with the onset of Islam, there was this aversion to wanting to distinguish between what the Byzantines were burning in their churches and sort of the pagan space of the Kaaba, with a more sort of subtle association to this religious ideology, and sense had a role in that. But within contemporary culture, I think it enters, just from personal and sort of social observations, it seems like it comes into play when thinking about hygiene and thinking about the clarity of the air, when thinking about ventilation. It plays a massive role. And all these sort of sickening scents when you enter certain hotels now that have like perfumes pumping through the ACs. I think they're associations, they're mental and psychological associations where you're reminded of a place because of the scent, and maybe marketing is coming into play now in the contemporary world.
Yeah, and in this way, it is architectural in a way, scent, right? If you smell the thick scent of jasmine inside, you can almost feel, even as I say that, a closed room. And if you walk past the plant outside, it can create a moment and a pause and a time signature in a way to scent as it relates to architecture. Question? Yeah, May. Uh-oh. I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed those two presentations, and I love how you can know people, like you've heard them speak before or you've read their work, and then they give you something more. And you just, feel like you're discovering them again. So thank you, Meitha and Ala, for that. And I guess I had a question for Meitha and a question for Ala. For Meitha, I wanted to ask you, how is doing this kind of research affecting your relationship to scent? So after doing this kind of work, learning about the history and kind of finding these traces, are you finding it kind of translating into your life in a new kind of way? I'm just curious about that. And I think, Ala, I wanted to tell you that I love, and we've had this conversation before, but, this kind of almost like artist as archive, but I was wondering whether you could tell us more about your process, because you've had, snippets of the actual archive itself. So images or videos, you've had sketches, which I think are mixed. Some are yours, some are from other places. Can you just maybe tell us a little bit more about what we were seeing on the screen?
Thank you, May. Same goes to you. I think I was also very much interested in how you could link all these practices together and always find the body and, the tensions and the fragilities, which I was also thinking of you when I was making my last slide in that presentation. The process is multi-layered. This is, the drawings are all mine. They are reproductions, in fact, of famous images that were printed or circulated by Darat al-Funun throughout their history, trying to, make people show up to events, or whether they are exhibitions or public talks or workshops, to the point that these images, which are mostly artworks, but sometimes they are like an image of a panel or someone explaining something, or so they are not always art, but they become like as if they are hallmarks, or as if they are the famous MoMA, I don't know, images that that circulate about a particular place. And I was interested in that, like people recognizing something or someone from the image that is overly used by the institution, but was considering that also as an act of education somehow, is basically by fostering or just making sure that people recognize that image somehow becomes I was interested in that aspect. And then when I was working with these images, in fact with these drawings, it was a commission for the 30th anniversary of Darat al-Funun, which was taking place in 2018. And it was a multi-phase exhibition, so I think I was in exhibition number 3 or 2. And at the time, I was interested in discovering myself, these aspects about these images and how I remember them and what I was associating them with, and with the proposal that me as an artist, but also as a dweller of Amman, was an audience in this institution. I worked in this institution, and of course, because I'm an artist as well, so I might have a little bit more knowledge than others. And then I was also as a student using the same institution. And so I was trying to figure out when I felt ownership or had access to the backstage, when I didn't, when I was doing this work. And that's how I made this little machine with the help of my sister that would automatically have some sort of 3 pencils or 3 graphite pencils who would be drawing on their own, some relationship between each other once they are put on. And that's the scribbles that you see that are in the background of all the drawings that I was trying to reproduce for these famous images. So I was trying to insert myself. And then the other relation I figured is basically what I partly presented is basically if Shakir Hassan is burning his works in the 80s because of the war, and Amal is burning her dress in 2007 because of illness or divorce or social pressures, and in between if Taysir Barakat is burning his art because he's boycotting art materials that are sold in the Israeli markets in Palestine, like in the West Bank, then as audience they must have, like the audience such as me, must have amassed some information or knowledge, situated knowledge of art history in Amman, and thus can respond to acts of historicity from a knowledgeable point because they've been educated by these public programs and have seen enough examples. Meanwhile, for this presentation, and in fact in 2022 when I was reading, because joining Mawrid allowed me to look into the diaries of Rafa and Nasiri, I read his 1992 diaries, which were as if he was writing my own diaries. He was going to the same bookstores, buying the same pencils, paper. He's sitting in the same cafes, drinking the same drinks, even when it's snowing and he cannot travel from one point to another. I was going through the same, but I was a student, he was an artist. So I was like thinking, it was like, what is this gift of, having an artist archive as if they are speaking on my behalf, but they are showing me something behind the scenes that I would not have had access to. And so I inserted this second voice in my presentation of Rafa's diaries on things that relate to the things that I was talking about, but it's a much bigger research that has many other artists implicated in it. And third was video resources that helped me in the first work, or in between these two versions of the work, which are basically generously posted by Dar al-Funun on their YouTube channel. So they digitize these encounters. And as I was going there to look at the art or to look at the audience, I was very much taken by the power dynamics between the speaker and the standing and the sitting and the work and the length of the answer and the audience and what the audience does to the. So all of this I was thinking about basically who's standing and who's sitting and who has this space of sharing, and with that sharing is basically shaping part of the public's knowledge. And so I tried to put these three layers, three archives on top of each other, as one way to also show how it was very difficult for me to separate any of these from each other when I was trying to work. That's it.
Thank you, May. To answer your question of how scent or smell, how I perceive them differently now, I think it has helped me not think about perfume or smell differently, but perhaps people, where I've been reading recently a lot on, for example, individuals who are diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and a way to sort of strengthen their memory is to have them smell scents from their teenage years or childhood. Similarly with music from their teenage years and childhood. And I think for me, perhaps perfume or smells take you places, and that's how, that's my sort of new image of it. But yeah.
Do you record your scent?
No.
Thank you. Questions? Yeah. Do we have a mic? Thank you.
Thank you all for such a great panel and for each presentation. Hi, May. This is Dania Tamimi, by the way. I have two questions, one for May and one for Meitha. May, you mentioned, you were talking about the absence of movement and how that created or birthed a new form of movement for you, which is quite parallel to the shape of Sukoon itself, a hollowed circle. So I'm curious to know if your current work and research with the Body Archive has been hinting or leading to another form of absence that's waiting to be mapped. Should I ask the next one? Okay. And my question to Meitha, okay, so it's quite interesting to sort of follow or map times and social spaces through scent. But I'm curious, from your perception, from your research, how would you imagine a physical space can be mapped through scent, an intangible material to sort of map or follow a physical, tangible space? And I'm thinking a parallel example of that could be how sound, an intangible element, can be sort of through its echo, can be used to materialize or understand a physical space. Thank you.
May, do you want to start?
Well, sure, I'm happy to. So I just wanted to say hello, and I'm so sorry I couldn't really see you because it's very interesting that on the one hand, sometimes I only see this massive picture of myself in the room, and other times I get to see a little bit the other three speakers and then the back of a few people's heads. So it's very minimal feedback for me on this call. But I wanted to just say that I think that's such a great question. And I think this moment of really kind of almost like meditating on what sukoon means, like, is it non-movement in this kind of antithetical sense? Is it a void, like the absence of the presence, or is it something else? And I think it's definitely something else. Recently, I gave a lecture performance at Istiqlal called Sukoon, and in an attempt to try to kind of unpack what that means, including its relationship to questions of language, translation, and embodiment. But I'm actually just at the very beginning of this process. And so in many ways, I'm actually really grateful to Selwa and Neda for inviting me to partake in this conversation, because it gave me a chance to really just be able to think with, and put my materials in a way that at least maybe is the beginning of some kind of inquiry. So yeah, so thank you.
Thank you. Meitha?
Thank you for the great question. For me, mapping scent perhaps is the process of how scent arrives. So mapping could be identifying the agricultural sites and the laborious sort of process of extraction. Mapping could be how these scents traveled through vessels and the residue within the vessels, or the sites of storage. Like, there are a few moments where descriptions, especially around Mecca and the Dome of the Rock, that talk about khazana or storage rooms, and that could be a way of sort of mapping where smell is sort of contained. And its after effect, I think that's more difficult, or maybe residues within archaeological remains, like in burners. Those are ways to sort of identify the remnants of maybe the chemical remnants of the sense, of the olfactory sort of, of the material itself. So those are different ways of mapping.
We have another.
Thank you. Thanks so much for these amazing talks. I have a question for Hala. You called the different kinds of elements in the slides layers, I think at the beginning of the talk, and making us pay attention to, or drawing our attention to the italicized section with all of the layers of the diary entries, the videos, your drawings and sketches, and the documentation of this drawing machine. I think I'm missing a few more. But do you see? Can you walk us through the links or relationships between these different interpretive and translated
Yes.
elements? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for your question. So the first slide with, maybe I show?
Yeah, I think you should, yeah.
Yay, I like this. This is Rafa al-Nasiri sitting on a panel with Shakir Hassan, who I failed to draw here. This is Shakir Hassan giving, speaking in the event that I was talking about, which is basically in 1992. This is a part of his work that is being burned, and with the burning it made a hole, and because of this hole he showed the work from both sides. So he put it in between two pieces of glass, and people can see it from both sides. This is part of Rafa al-Nasiri's diaries, where he is talking about a big fray or a big battle or something that included Shakir Hassan and Ali Talib in the Schumann Foundation. He mentions the audience, which is a nice thing because the audience is introduced from the beginning. And yeah, that how this table brought many Iraqi artists to talk about the histories of the Iraqi artists. And you have maybe noticed that in this film, this is Shakir Hassan, but the center here was Ismail Fattah, whose sculpture is also a very hallmark, is a very famous image of Darat al-Funun, because this, the man sitting, which I should have included, is overlooking, is in the gardens of the Dara, overlooking the city of Amman, so it's always the most photographed part. So it's the same drawing, but I covered, I had covered parts of it and revealed other parts. This is a redrawing of the two persons who said this or this, who were in the video about this critic who tried to criticize Marwan's work or kind of express what he thought about Marwan's work. These are the two guys or persons who tried to oppress the speaker, the critic. And interestingly, Abdurrahman Munif had a very big following already in Amman in '92. And perhaps that was also what drew a lot of people to come and meet Marwan, because they came to see Munif. So it was a strategic thing also to bring a famous literary figure to the event, and with that drag more people to come and check the art or meet the artist. And so here Rafa says that they couldn't even enter the Amman event for Munif, and they had to meet him in the smaller city of Irbid, where he was teaching along with Ali Talib, who's sitting here. And this is Marwan, this is Ibrahim Nasrallah, and this is supposedly Munif. And these are the two guys who said. And then here, this is a painting that is also very famous, and it was there at Darat al-Funun for decades by Marwan. It's called Al-Waqif, or the standing. And this is me in one of our workshops at Darat al-Funun. And this type of audience, and here we see Tamam al-Akhal, and next to her is her husband, Ismail Shammout, and they're famous Palestinian artists who had relocated also after the Gulf War to settle in Amman. So the audience can be as famous as the master, artists of the Palestinian scene or the Iraqi scene, and it can also be only general audience in Amman. So it was very, very varied. And these are more connections or points from Rafa on encounters with Shakir's works, where he is sometimes, like Rafa al-Nasiri, is criticizing the theories that are presented in these lectures, but he is very much admiring the art that is being presented in the same events. And this is a machine, and it has me as a student, me as an artist audience, and me as a worker at Darat al-Funun. And this is a Hadid. It's a 3D print, but she's also in the drawing, and she's standing next to the scale. And scale here is presented as a drawing, but also as a tool, as a scale, but also as a tool. And here I thought that it was very cute how Rafa was talking very intimately with the people in the in the talk, and yeah, it is with this type of, very personal. He was taking everything, and it shows in his drawings. And I thought I have only made him speak through his texts, and I thought it's nice to have him at least show how he, you could see his body, how he talks. And finally here, this is Amal Qinnawi, she is sewing her dress, and this is Shakir, and this is a heart that appears in Amal's drawing. And this is how top view of the drawing that was produced by the machine. And these are objects that belong to either Amal, my reproduction of it, but to other stories that are not in this short presentation. And it was very important. It was very interesting for me to be part of, helping an artist, make a work that is going to disappear in 1 minute or two as part of a performance. And this fire kind of, with its violence and all of that, but also with its a very delicate artistic meaning, had stayed very much inside me. That, that it is. Yeah, it made me understand very well, building it, sewing it, but also burning it with the artist. How, what is the type of feelings that an artist can be looking at? And or trying to communicate. What I want to say is that I was very much appreciative of how all these artists, they were able or capable or trying to start anew from this. This is to answer your question somehow, Patrick. About how do you deal with these losses. With these losses, is basically all these artists, they're starting anew every time they're arriving to these new sites. And similarly, Jordan was also launching itself somehow, or relaunching itself in this moment in the 90s. So I was interested in that too, and trying to just make it come alive through this very complex web of relations. And thank you for asking this question, so that I explain all this work I put in this presentation.
How does your relationship change to the image that you're, in the reanimation or the reenactment through drawing the photo or the video? How does your relationship to it change? Is there new knowledge that you derive?
Yes. First of all, how limited reproduction is. That's the first thing I realized. But then something else comes out. Sometimes these figures, they look like they are someone else, or they. In fact, this act of reproducing them also helped me connect the figures to other situations, or they would. You are trying to draw Shakir, but he turns out to look like, I don't know, someone else. And so I was like, why is this person I'm thinking about now? And then I look up and there's some sort of a relation, or I force a relation because he kind of appeared in the process. But the other thing that happens is that I start to own the images when I redraw them. And that was also, anyways, a way that I learned back in 2013, maybe, when I was trying to source some images for the funeral of Gamal Abdel Nasser for a project that I was working on. And the images that I liked very much were very expensive to license. So I I traced them into using carbon paper, and started re-owning the images again. But because funeral of Gamal Abdel Nasser basically has Egyptians in them, or Arabs, or and I was thinking, how would I pay $200 or 100 pounds to get an image of my feelings or my grandfather's feeling, so I redrew them, or I tried to find, for instance, where they are printed and sold for cheaper, for instance, on the cover of Newsweek magazine or something, and this kind of a challenge. This challenge helped me find other ways to also have some ownership on the images without necessarily breaking or without putting myself and the work and everybody in very awkward positions of copylifting.
Yeah, and in fact, now their archive is part of your archive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, because to be honest, I was really moved by the three presentations. Really, really, definitely, this is the word. And moved because there is no distance between your body, your thought, your identity, and the archive you are manipulating. And this demonstrated that artists have the power also to write the narrative and to write the history, but in another way. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to ask the most quick and simple question to May. I loved your presentation and the slide with the questions. And in these slides with all the questions, you asked one question that I find fantastic. Is preservation the primary purpose? Specifically for a seminar where we are trying to... I love this question, and do you have an answer?
Thank you so much. There was an earlier comment yesterday by somebody who had given a compliment and said, to one of the speakers, you're like an artist. You are asking more questions than you're providing answers. And I thought to myself, oh, that's a lovely cop-out. I'm going to start using that,
Well, it was me, in fact.
Okay. So I think I got the person right. It is a tough question, this question that you're asking, this question that I pose and that I think about often. And I think, if I were to just reflect a little bit on things that I've heard yesterday and things that I've heard today, I would say that if we are to use the example of the archive of destruction, which I found such a beautiful and compelling notion of thinking about monuments and also physical archives as sentient and have lives of their own and can tell stories of their own in ways that, for example, in my work, because it's the body and we take for granted that the body is somehow alive and can feel, we do many of these things, but what does it mean to do that when we're working with, let's say, a much more kind of traditional idea of like physical documents? And in that sense, then this idea of destruction or renewal or reimagination is part and parcel of the process. And so it's not at all preservation, it's this other thing. And similarly, a few years ago, I attended a wonderful talk at Sharjah. It was part of March meeting. And I don't remember the exact details, but what I did take away from that beautiful presentation was that there is an archive of Dalit lives in India that is not concerned at all with preservation, but actually they assume that there is such an abundance of material that will be voluntarily given to the place that it constantly reproduces new material coming in, and they don't police any of the material coming out. So the model is in fact very different. It's not about establishing ownership or cataloging or even making any kind of claim about knowing. It is really about producing a flow of material that constantly regenerates itself and makes itself useful according to the people who will use it. So, that's a very different kind of model than many of the institutional archives that I think we're familiar with. But I do think that there's a lot of room for experimentation with what even the word preservation means. Like, what does it mean, to try to preserve? So, for example, one of the interesting things that emerged for me this year as I taught this class was that, we often think of memories as necessarily tied to our experiences. So we'll say, this thing happened and I remembered it, or maybe I didn't remember it fully, or maybe, in fact, I wasn't even aware of it. It came to me in the form of a reaction, like I was triggered. So I don't remember the traumatic incident, but my actions in this moment indicate to me that I have this memory. So you could do that, and that really assumes that somehow you have this memory. But we can also think of what Julieta Singh calls the ghost archive, which is stories that we have, that we remember, but in fact, we never experienced them. They were just stories that were told to us when we were children about ourselves. We actually don't remember ourselves as children, but we were told you did this, or you like this, or I remember the day you wore this and you, but somehow in our memories, it becomes this thing. And so I think this question of preservation is a really, a really good one. And I hope that I didn't disappoint you by answering the question, but maybe by giving you more questions than what we started with.
I think I'm similarly struck by the beauty of the three presentations together. And I just want to observe that I think one aspect maybe that the presentations share is this narration of moments of pause and then release, and where where whatever is released seems to move forward and backward. So the chronologies of the thought are very excitingly different than I think some of the other panels. So Meitha, you had a line that I'm still trying to think about. Scent is thought of as invisible only once it is released, if I caught that. So only once the vessel that had been carrying the perfume breaks, then the invisibility or imperceptibility can be thought or recognized. And that made me think about the other panels also, of course, the hold that May was talking about, and then movement in multiple directions. I do have one question, and it's for Allah. Light. So you started with fire, you ended with fire. And it felt to me, in trying to think that arc with you, as if the light qualities of the videos were enhanced. There was a way in which suddenly my memories of what you were showing via the Darat al-Funun video archive, including the Marwan painting from the 60s of, I think, the poet Sayyib, or whoever it is, the martyr that Marwan shows, it suddenly is bathed in light as if the fire of both sides is striking it. So the question is, did you enhance the color? And the larger question is, is that an element of this practice to try to invite us to think these sequences in forward, backward?
Yes. Thank you for noticing. Yes, I was talking about the slides because I found that it was very interesting that Shakir Hassan is standing in between his artworks showing slides. He's standing in an exhibition showing slides of his works, and he's saying that the slides are not good enough, or the colors are not good enough. Again, we are in archives working with the leftovers of, photography and slides and all that, so I thought that was a nice or an interesting link to whatever quality that, whether we come to much later or even in the life of the artist, that it wasn't fitting. I did not enhance any colors except for my photographs, just to match the whiteness, not as. But yes, the technology did improve. So in the first recordings of Marwan's, for instance, meetings in 95, I think, was it, or 96, the Waqif, you cannot read it at all. But in the second recording, in 2 years later, it was much nicer colors. So yes, also Abdurrahman Munif speaks about how in darkness, as he walked by these, when he was at night visiting or passing by Jawad Salim's house, he would appreciate how lights made more visible parts of the works that he thought that there were centers of focus that they're worth focusing on. So it was very interesting to see what is lighting and what is illuminating throughout these and what is not, and why is that. And there was also one comment that I found in Rafa's diaries that is also about how very nicely his wife, May Mudaffar, the poet and the art critic, had delivered her talk, but the slides were not as good. Yeah, so it was always about, what is this medium that is communicating, that is not beyond, the imagery, that is not doing its best or doing its best only in personal encounter and without the intermediacy of the words, such as when, also Munif says, I don't try to talk to artists because their world is dangerous. And yes. And a little bit of, so it's a little bit of trying to also respond to the questions that we have also at Al-Mawrid today, because we are working on all these artists at the moment, and their diaries, and their notes, and their papers. And I'm trying, or I wanted to also be a little bit more, it's like every time, in fact, I was very nervous presenting this because I wasn't sure if I'm exploiting the audience, coming from very long time ago, and to be revisited in the future. But yeah, I try as much as possible also not to, render them in negative light, because that's not also why I'm looking at all of this and trying to understand where and how our knowledge of art kind of, and of course of other disciplines, have come together in the public space, and what stood in the way, what facilitated that, and what stood in the way. And I think that also relates to our story, to aspects of illumination and closed circles.
Thank you. How many people here have an archive, are maintaining their own archive consciously right now? Can a show of hands?
Take a photo.
Yeah. Salwa better get her hand up. I don't even know what to say. I'm going to go over there and archive her tonight. It's interesting to think about, right? That we are here as if we're studying something, but we're studying something that we're also, the majority of us, engaged in active practice. And in any kind of artistic practice, the form is the first question, like what is the content and what is the form that will elicit and hold and maintain and preserve or interrogate the content the most. I know for myself it's been very inspiring. It's not one form. No, it can't be. Other questions from the group? Any other questions from the group? Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question for Meitha regarding scent as a trigger, and whether that, the way you've described scent in the archive is as one that is about environment, or trying to think of how the environmental qualities could fill up a volume of space, or that's the way I understood. And I was wondering if you found connections to scent as a trigger, especially the thing I think about with scent and film or scent and medium is this, like, it must have been 60s or 70s with the smellorama or scentorama, where there were triggers for different scents to be put in the theater that would match what was on screen, and whether you've encountered any of that in these times. Thank you.
I haven't, but I've been trying to find indications of why they were using fragrant smells to like, were they trying to counter an existing scent, to camouflage a particular scent? And that doesn't, like, ideas of like foul smells don't appear unless they're talking about the ingredient itself or the compound mixture within medicinal sort of oils or pastes that were, but I haven't found examples yet or descriptions of an environment or a space that was, that they were trying to sort of react to, but mainly to try and trigger particular emotions, or like there was one, this doesn't answer your question specifically, but there was a couple of recipes for the different caliphs and their soap, their bars of soap, and I found that quite strange and particular to want to associate, to sort of go above and beyond to produce this sort of form or material that's particular, with musks that come from a very particular region, and it's mentioned within the recipe. So it's those were the moments that appeared in the archive or in the text. Yes. Exactly. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, I want to say a few words on behalf of the conveners, Nada Shabut and Annika Lensen and myself, to thank you all for joining us today, and also particularly grateful to all the speakers and the moderators. And a very special thank you to Maha and Meitha and our students who have been amazing. A big clap. Thank you so much, Maha. Really, it was wonderful. After I heard yesterday's and today's talks, you know, I would revise the title of this conference and know that the archive is much more than with the generative and the process and beyond that. And at this juncture in the lifetime, the short lifetime of our center, as we start our next 5 years and renewal application, I want to thank Professor Dabbagh for her contributions to expanding our notion what an archive is. I knew the day I met May the first time that she would be an amazing addition to the center, and to work with collaboratively with her on her many creative ideas. So thank you, May, so many times. And now we have closing remarks by our Dean of Arts and Humanities, Professor Awam Amka, who will join us through the Zoom. I believe he's waiting. So thank you, Awam. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Until we have Dean Awam on. All participants, after we end, please stay so we can take a photo together, group photo. Also, anyone saw a tote bag with sunglasses in them? Because I lost them. Those are mine. So in case you do, just in case, check yours.
Okay, I think I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Okay. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I apologize. I'm only attending electronically, but I've been online for the last hour, listening to your various contributions. Your topic is something I myself personally attracted to and involved with. In fact, that's why I'm not there today, because I'm doing an archival conference in Venice. But I really want to use this opportunity to thank each and every one of you for attending this important event, but also for drawing attention to Mawrid Arab Center for the Study of Art, that has actually added significantly to the kind of excellence we aspire for, not only in our studies of art regionally, but also in its intersections with the study of art globally. and we couldn't even be luckier to have a person in the stature of Salwa Muqtadi, who is really herself an archive, the daughter of archivists, and has also generated varieties of interest among students, amongst mentees worldwide in looking at archive and practicing archiving. It's really a great honor to have her as a colleague and friend, and without her, we couldn't have actually begun to imagine the foundations of the kind of generative infrastructure that Al-Mawrid signifies. So I really want to thank her for her incredible sacrifice over the years, and our ability too for giving that sacrifice a continuing home. And for those of you who continue to relate to us, we hope this is just the beginning of many beginnings in what Al-Mawrid has set out to do. And I want to thank you all on behalf of the Vice Chancellor, Maria Westerman, and Provost Ali Peters, and of course the Division of Arts and Humanities. Really want to thank you for all you've done, and thank you for the opportunity to bring this event to a close. Thank you.